push this to turn it on and it lights up.
I'd be surprised if I...
The Subcommittee on Workforce Protections will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to call a recess at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on examining Biden's war on independent contractors. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing. Today's hearing is about the right to earn a living, the right to practice your profession and pursue your calling, to be a maker, a builder, a creator, to take your God-given talents, nurture them with heart and soul, and offer them to the world. In a free society, few rights are more fundamental or more essential to a dynamic and prosperous economy. Yet at this moment, that right is in peril. The current administration has launched a multi-pronged assault on the right to earn a living in America. It is a concerted strategy designed to limit or eliminate the gig economy, freelancing, independent contracting, self-employment, alternate work arrangements that entire careers are based on and entire industries have been built around. The livelihoods of millions of Americans are at risk. Today, we will examine the devastating consequences of this anti-worker agenda. Those consequences are not a matter of speculation. They are already an established reality, a bitter, unfair, unnecessary reality for many residents of my own state. You see, in California, the war on independent contractors has been underway for years. The Biden administration is simply following the model of Governor Gavin Newsom and the California legislature. At this point, the administration's governing motto might as well be, as California goes, so goes the nation. Now, I should say, as a Californian, that we used to look upon that expression with pride. Over decades, the Golden State forged an identity of historic significance and was at the leading edge of social, political, and technological progress. Ronald Reagan, in his inaugural address as governor, said California should never take second place. We were the state where anyone could get ahead. Now, sadly, we've become the state many can't wait to leave behind. We do lead the nation, but in all of the wrong ways: poverty, inequality, taxes, regulations, income stagnation, and yes, departures. In 2022, for the third straight year, California ranked first among the 50 states in U-Haul rentals. In its current condition, California is the last place that should be a bellwether for political change in America. Yet that is exactly how President Biden seems to see it, as his administration attempts to nationalize California's most damaging policies, exporting our state's failures to every state in the union. In nationalizing the war on workers, Biden has opened three distinct fronts. The first is the PRO Act, which passed the House in the last Congress and has been reintroduced this year by the ranking member of this committee. This legislation takes a specific California law known as AB 5 and makes it into federal policy. President Biden is supporting the PRO Act, and when running for president, he voiced support for California's AB 5 and cited it as his model, even after the law received bipartisan condemnation of a kind without precedent in recent history. For example, Governor Newsom's own former deputy chief of staff, Yashar Ali, called AB 5 one of the most destructive pieces of legislation in the last 20 years, adding, "It's truly horrific how many people are negatively affected by it." Former State Assembly Speaker and San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown said the law made him want to, quote, picket against the, quote, bastards at the Capitol and the special interests that took advantage of them. Andrew Cuomo rejected a similar law in New York, saying he didn't want to, quote, make the same mistake as California. The Daily Kos likewise warned other states, don't make the same mistake California's Gavin Newsom did, with the site's founder calling the law disastrous and asinine and its supporters shameful. The head of the California NAACP assailed AB 5 as a terrible law and a gut punch to our community. The CEO of the Black Chamber of Commerce called it a catastrophe responsible for enabling, defending, and propagating systemic racism. 200 PhD economists, including a Nobel laureate, reported the law is doing substantial and avoidable harm to the very people who now have the fewest resources and the worst alternatives available to them. One commentator called it the most malicious and harmful law ever passed in California. AB 5 rendered countless independent professionals unable to earn a living in our state. Writers, interpreters, court reporters, musicians, language pathologists, photographers, forensic nurses, and people in literally hundreds of other industries were told they were no longer allowed to practice their profession and serve their clients as they'd been doing their whole careers. Instead, their only option was to find a single hiring entity to monopolize their services and make them a W-2 employee. For many, that was simply not possible. I have compiled their stories in this book, Personal Testimonials of Californians Who Lost Their Livelihoods After AB 5 was passed. Turning AB 5 into national policy would multiply these losses. The Chamber of Progress published an economic analysis which shows that implementing AB 5's rigid ABC test as a national rule would cost the full-time or part-time jobs of between 3.2 and 3.8 million independent contractors, equivalent to roughly half the jobs lost in the Great Recession. Even where it is possible to convert independent contractors into employees by legal command, it's not what they want. 79% of independent contractors prefer their current worker status. It lets them set their own schedules and be their own boss. Only 10% say they'd prefer a traditional job. The people most devastated by AB 5 are the most vulnerable: seniors, caregivers, students, single mothers, people with disabilities or health issues or mental health needs who rely on independent contracting to balance work with their personal life circumstances. AB 5 has not only been rejected by the very people it is supposedly meant to help, it's also been rejected by California voters and by the courts. In 2020, voters overwhelmingly passed a proposition overturning the law for app-based drivers. And the Ninth Circuit recently held that AB 5 may violate the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, as over 100 professions have now been exempted from the law, while hundreds of others remain ensnared by it with no rational basis for who is allowed to work and who isn't. Fortunately, the PRO Act, the national legislation inspired by AB 5, has not become law. Yet the Biden administration has now opened another front in the war on independent contractors to achieve the same goal. A proposed rule at the Department of Labor would implement the core elements of AB 5 without so much as a vote of Congress. In other words, in a matter of months, the Biden administration is planning to nationalize AB 5 all on its own. And to aggressively enforce the new regime, Biden has selected a new Secretary of Labor. This is the final front, the nomination of AB 5's architect and lead enforcer, former California Labor Secretary Julie Su, to the highest labor position in America. It is a direct and literal transfer of California's failures to Washington. Tellingly, with Su's confirmation for U.S. Secretary of Labor now faltering, her backers are making a last-ditch attempt to save her nomination by absurdly trying to dissociate her from AB 5. None other than the author of AB 5, a major Su backer who now leads the California Labor Federation, just told the LA Times that Su was not involved with the bill at all. Yet Su, in her own words, described in detail her plans for enforcing AB 5 as California Labor Secretary. We will be doing investigations and audits, she said, threatening fines and penalties, so that those who want to comply with the need to reclassify can do so, and those who don't will understand that's not the kind of economy we want in California. Not the kind of economy we want in California. That's what she said. Julie Su didn't want an economy in California where you can pursue your calling, support your family on your own terms, and thrive. She doesn't want this for America either. That's why Joe Biden has selected her for Labor Secretary, to wage his war on independent contractors. Our committee has a very different vision for the American workforce. We believe in promoting work and supporting workers. We believe independent contractors are critical to the 21st century economy. We will protect the freedom of Americans to earn a living as they choose, and will fight every effort to take that right away. With that, I look forward to the hearing today and yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman Kiley, and good morning. I want to thank our witnesses, first of all, for being here for our first Workforce Protection Subcommittee hearing this Congress. One of the subcommittee's most important responsibilities is to protect workers by ensuring relevant federal laws are followed. Chairman Kiley, I hope that we can work together in good faith to fulfill this responsibility. Under federal law, employees have a wide range of basic workforce protections, including minimum wage, overtime, collective bargaining, and health and safety protections. But when workers who should be employees under the law are instead misclassified as independent contractors, they lose out on these protections. This can mean a significant loss of income and benefits. For example, the typical misclassified construction worker loses up to $16,000 per year. But it's not just workers who are harmed by misclassification. For decades, unscrupulous employers have used misclassification as a strategy to cut down on labor costs and both exploit insufficient penalties and the limited capacity of underfunded enforcement agencies. In fact, as many as 30% of employers are currently misclassifying their employees. As Mr. Long of the National Electrical Contractors Association noted in his written testimony, low-road employers who misclassify workers gain an unfair competitive disadvantage. They have no incentive to invest in training their workforce to be safer and more efficient, and they create hazardous situations on the job sites. Finally, worker misclassification harms our economy by depriving our government of billions of dollars in badly needed tax revenue that could be spent on improving our communities. The reality is that the misclassification of workers as independent contractors is a pervasive problem for workers, for law-abiding businesses, for taxpayers, and our economy. And this is why the Biden administration has proposed a responsible rule to fix this problem. Committee Democrats strongly support this proposed rule. But let me be clear. The proposed rule is not California's state law entitled AB 5, which adapts what's known as the ABC test. The Biden administration clearly noted that it is, and I quote, legally constrained from adopting the ABC test and could only implement it if the Supreme Court revisits its precedent or if Congress passes legislation to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act or the FLSA. And that should be the end of the story. But Republicans appear intent on kicking up as much dust as they can and trying their hardest to undermine Acting Secretary Sue's nomination to be Secretary of Labor. Yet again, Republicans are putting politics over the people. But my Republican colleagues may also wish to turn back the clock to when the previous administration moved to make it easier for employers to misclassify workers. And this would have been unpinned the long-standing standard for determining whether someone is an employee or an independent contractor. And according to the Economic Policy Institute, it would have cost workers nearly $4 billion each year in lost wages. The Biden administration was right to rescind this proposal and to push to restore the poor standard for determining workers' status as employees or independent contractors. In doing so, the Biden-Harris administration and congressional Democrats are standing with those cooks and dishwashers and home health care workers, the electricians, the carpenters, and many others who are being denied minimum wage and overtime protections because their employers wrongly classified them as independent contractors and not as employees. We're standing with high-round employers who play by the rules and deserve a level playing field when competing for work. And it's very clear that committee Republicans are standing for something else, and they want this hearing to be about one person, Acting Secretary Sue. Committee Democrats remain focused on all American workers and ensuring that they are not wrongly denied protections guaranteed under the law. And so I hope that my colleagues will put politics aside and take concrete steps to protect workers and to help our workers succeed. I want to thank our witnesses again for the testimony that they're going to give. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all committee members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. after 14 days from the date of this hearing, which is May 4th, 2023. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days after the date of this hearing to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I will now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses. The first witness is Karen Anderson, who is the founder of Freelancers Against AB5, an ad hoc all-volunteer group with 18,500 members, comprised of independent contractors, small business owners, nonprofits, and others, representing 600 categories of professions and sectors. She's a third-generation Southern Californian with a 25-year career as a freelance writer, managing editor, and photographer. The second witness is Tanny McCutcheon, who is a senior affiliate with Resolution Economics and who previously served as the administrator of the Wage and Hour Division at the Department of Labor. The third witness is David Long, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Electrical Contractors Association and previously served as president of Miller Electric Company, where he first started as a construction wireman. The fourth witness is Leah Palagashvili, who is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and is a research fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at New York University Law. The fifth witness is Laura Padin, who is Director of Work Structures at the National Employment Law Project, where her work focuses on workplace standards, economic security, and temporary and gig economy workers. And the sixth witness is Kim Cavan, who is the co-founder of Fight for Freelancers USA and is a freelance editor and writer. We thank all of the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, I would ask that you each limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I would also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. I will first recognize Ms. Anderson.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Kiley, Ranking Member Adams, and distinguished members for having me here today. After AB 5 was signed into law in September 2019, I knew it was an existential threat to my career. Soon thereafter, I launched a public Facebook group called Freelancers Against AB 5 so that I could connect with other people to find out how AB 5 was affecting everyone, be it nurse practitioners, videographers, golf caddies, or whomever else might see my page and want to share their experiences. Little did I know I would have a front row seat to hundreds and hundreds of negative stories pouring in from all income levels, demographics, political affiliations, and the vast swath of professions, trades, nonprofits, and sectors, as well as small business owners being put out of business for alleged misclassification violations, be it music store owners, audio tech installers, videography platforms, or architectural designers. Even before the law went into effect in January 2020, I heard from hundreds of individuals who had lost their careers overnight after being given notice by their clients that they could no longer legally utilize independent contractors from California. I received stories about children's theaters closing, local bar bands unable to perform, interpreters sidelined by the law, and court reporters suddenly without assignments, to name a few. Entire sectors that have been negatively impacted by AB 5 include small and regional theaters, indie filmmakers, the spa and wellness community, wedding planners, nonprofit arts groups, and the freelance transcription profession, which is now all but extinct in California due to AB 5. Speech-language pathologists had to abandon their elderly patients whom they were teaching to learn how to swallow after recovering from a stroke. The sign language interpreters told me they could not provide ADA-mandated services to the deaf and hard of hearing after AB 5 was passed. Seniors who had thrived with their self-employment opportunities were suddenly unemployable due to ageism in the workplace. Forensic nurses told me that AB 5 is detrimental to rape victims, especially at rural hospitals where without forensic nurses to perform forensic evidentiary medical exams, victims of sexual assault are subject to long wait times or substandard exams by untrained medical personnel. All told, within my group, we've identified more than 600 categories of professions impacted in some way by AB 5 and its ABC test. Despite the so-called exemptions for certain professions added in September 2020, the law continues to wreak havoc on legitimate independent contractors, entrepreneurs, and small business owners. Many exemptions come with caveats and fine print that make them nearly impossible to take advantage of. The law also creates a chilling effect in which businesses don't want to utilize independent contractors from California at all, even if there is a pathway to an exemption because there are so many potential landmines. Authored by former Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, who now leads California Labor Federation, AB 5 represents a scorched earth approach to policymaking. Recently, on March 17, 2023, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals validated what we've known all along about the arbitrary exemptions process that picks winners and losers with no rhyme or reason. The decision was in response to a lawsuit from 2019 filed by rideshare and delivery drivers against AB 5 called Olson versus State of California. The case was dismissed in February 2020 before even being heard. In the Ninth Circuit decision last month, a three-judge panel rebuked Lorena Gonzalez for her blatant animus not based in reason against the plaintiff and for engaging in backroom dealing. The court stated that the counsel for the state during oral arguments was unable to articulate any conceivable rationale for the exemptions of AB 5 as amended. And the court stated it is plausible that AB 5 violates the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment as alleged by the plaintiffs, and that the bill borders on corruption, quote, pure spite and naked favoritism. The case is being sent back to the lower court for review. It is not speculation in California what can happen with a law like AB 5 and the ABC test. We are literally the canaries in a coal mine. On behalf of the independent professionals in California, I ask that the cautionary tale of AB 5 and its ABC test be a warning to the nation so that these types of destructive policies don't spread nationwide. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Anderson. I will next recognize Ms. McCutcheon.
Thank you, Chairman Kiley and Ranking Member Adams and members of the committee. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. This is an important topic for me personally, not only as a former wage and hour administrator, but as a gig worker myself, and for my brother who drives for Uber Eats and Grubhub. The independent workforce is growing, and it's here to stay. Almost 65 million Americans take part in the independent workforce, most because they want to, not because they must. Half are women, half are under the age of 42, 25% are minorities. Most are happier, healthier, more secure, and more optimistic about the future than traditional employees. The independent workforce is the right choice for many workers. But too many regulators want to take that choice off the table for most or even all of the workers by expanding the definition of employee and restricting the independent contractor standards. There is a war on independent contracting. Why? Many have the misperception that independent workers are exploited because they are not eligible for overtime, don't have access to employer-provided health care, and are not covered by other employment protections. Of course, this assumes that 65 million workers, or a large part of them, are unaware that they are not protected by employment laws or somehow have been coerced into working independently. Even with the trade-offs, choosing the freedom and flexibility of independent work over being controlled by an employer is a rational choice. Now, the war is fueled by the chaos of legal standards for determining who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. In my written testimony, I provide an overview of federal and state laws. I cannot summarize the legal morass in 5 minutes, perhaps not even in 5 hours. Short version, it's a mess. Theoretically, most federal statutes define the term employee using a common law test, but they're all different. The IRS used a 20-factor test, although they now group those factors under 3 main categories. The EEOC has a 16-factor test, and the NLRB has a 10-factor test. Now, the Supreme Court says that the DOL must use an economic reality test under the FLSA. How is that defined? Well, more multi-factor balancing tests, of course. The courts and the DOL have all used different factors at different times. 5 factors, 6 factors, 7 factors, and even similar factors are not quite the same from court to court. Different courts balance the factors differently. And that's just the federal government. By my last count, there are no less than 100 state statutes regulating independent contractor under 6 different types of employment and tax laws. Within a single state, as under federal law, one person can be an employee under the wage and hour laws, but an independent contractor under the tax laws. Now, this chaos opens the door to abuse. Regulators can choose at will from a menu of different factors and facts to reach whatever result they want. There is no predictability, and that's what businesses fear. Alas, the DOL's proposed changes to its independent contractor regulation would just increase the chaos. Prior to 2021, DOL had no regulations, only a few scattered opinion letters and fact sheets. The 2021 regulations established 2 core factors for the economic reality test: who controls the work and whether the worker had an opportunity for profit or loss. If those factors pointed in different directions, then an additional 3 factors could be considered. Still complex, but an improvement. Theoretically, these regulations are in force now because the Biden administration's attempt to withdraw them was found to be illegal. Despite this, the DOL doesn't seem to be following them. The DOL has proposed to replace the 2021 regulations with another 6-factor test, but also adds these 6 factors are not exhaustive, additional factors may be relevant, and the weight to give each factor depend on the particular circumstances in the case. In other words, as proposed, the DOL can consider any fact it wants or refuse to consider any fact it wants. The Biden administration, with no notice and no rule changes, could implement California AB 5, the unpassed PRO Act, or use a Ouija board to determine who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. The definition of an employee needs to be the same under every federal statute and, in fact, state law. We need one clear and simple rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McCutcheon. Our next witness is Mr. Long.
Good morning, Chairman Riley and Ranking Member Adams and the members of the subcommittee. My name is David Long. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the National Electrical Contractors Association. National Electrical Contractors Association is the leading voice in a $500 billion electrical contracting industry in America that brings power, light, communications, technology to our critical facilities and homes across America. In NECA, we collectively represent over 4,000 electrical contracting firms across America who spend millions of dollars on training, health care, insurance, and retirement funds for our critical workers. We thank you for holding this hearing, allowing us the opportunity to explain that the threat of the worker misclassification and the confusion around this process poses the ability of law-abiding entrepreneur employers in the construction industry to compete, innovate, create jobs for the critical infrastructure of America. In the construction industry, the misclassification is a choice to disregard the legal responsibilities of being an employer or an employee. It provides a competitive advantage by failing to ensure the financial obligations are met that responsible businesses do every day. This effect is not just on NECA contractors, but thousands and thousands of small construction businesses who abide by the law and try to compete into a free market economy in which they embrace. Labor bidding advantages are such as the following. Construction contractor industry members pursue their work through cost competitive bidding process every day. Minimum wage, overtime, FICA taxes, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, liability insurance to the customer. In these misclassification schemes, these contractors are allowed to submit lower bids because they do not have to worry about the list that I just mentioned above. And the burden will ultimately fall upon the taxpayer or the customer or even the individual to make up the difference. Cost to the taxpayers. The U.S. government study over 20 years ago found that misclassification workers resulted in a loss of overall unemployment insurance revenue of over $200 million annually, as well as unpaid federal government. There was more than $2.75 billion of unpaid Social Security, unemployment insurance, and income taxes. In fact, in the state of D.C., in the city of D.C. alone, construction companies who elect to go with independent contracting can see an advantage between 16 and 40% on competitive engagement in various areas. The state of Ohio Attorney General estimated that a misclassification worker is at least a 20 to 30% competitive cost advantage against responsible entrepreneur, small business construction companies. The Department of Labor and their attorney counterparts put a press release of good work that they're doing, but however, it is very clear that competitive advantage to 1099 workers compared to entrepreneurs who are trying to build businesses in our communities is at a complete disadvantage because of these breaks that they're allowed. Conclusion from our viewpoint. Responsible contractors want an open and fair marketplace. We have done it for decades and centuries. On projects where fellow competitors are on even playing field, but trying to compete with folks who can absolutely cut their bid on bid day by 40% is a race to the bottom. Let me reconfirm. This is a major impact to our small contractor entrepreneurs across America in the construction industry, and it eventually will affect the contractor worker in every community. Thank you for holding this hearing. I hope that it will result in some concrete proposals. I'm anxious to address the rampant use of the misclassification of a worker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Long. Our next witness is Ms. Palagojvili.
Good morning, Chairman Kiley, Ranking Member Adams, and members of the Subcommittee Workforce Protection. It's an honor to testify before you. My name is Leah Palagashvili, and I'm an economist at the Marketa Center at George Mason University. My research focus is on the independent workforce and the evolving nature of work. Today, my testimony focuses on the Department of Labor's proposed rule that impacts about 60 million independent workers nationwide. I'd like to present 3 considerations in evaluating the proposed restrictions. 1, the diverse and growing workforce. 2, the expected job losses from the DOL's rule. And 3, the adverse impact on women. 1 out of every 3 Americans work outside of traditional employment today, either for their primary or secondary sources of income. These independent workers span across industries, skills, and educational attainment. For example, they can be musicians, ride-sharing and delivery drivers, software developers, graphic designers, landscapers, Instagram influencers, and self-employed online merchants. According to IRS tax data, professional, scientific, and technical services make up the largest share of independent contractors and has seen the fastest growth in independent contractors since 2001. While Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash are ubiquitous in our everyday lives, according to the tax data, these workers amount to fewer than 10% of the overall independent contractor workforce. Beyond that, the tax data show that app-based workers are primarily supplemental earners who have full-time jobs elsewhere. One part of the DOL's proposed independent contractor rule adds new considerations that significantly limit the circumstances under which a worker can be legally classified as an independent contractor. The DOL is doing this in hopes that organizations will hire workers as employees instead. Now, at first glance, it seems like a win for those who might be reclassified as employees and receive benefits. However, that is unlikely to be the case for the majority of workers. That's because it's impossible for every single independent work opportunity to turn into a full-time employment offer. A recent example to demonstrate this point is when California passed AB 5, which is a similar law that restricts independent work opportunities, and supporters applauded it as a win for workers. But some of those same supporters changed their minds later when news outlets like the New York Times and the LA Times highlighted how difficulty in compliance, complexity, and confusion with the law had led to job losses, especially among freelance musicians, truck drivers, and writers. And for many organizations like newspapers, theaters, music venues, all small businesses, it was now all of a sudden to work and it was all of a sudden illegal to work with their freelancers, so those freelancers lost their jobs. Following this backlash, California later exempted these professions and many others from AB 5. I would like to emphasize here that jobs were saved in California when more than 100 professions and industries were exempted from AB 5. But the DOL's rule cannot exempt any professions or industries, which means that its rule will have far more significant and wide-reaching consequences across our economy and all our jobs. These job losses are especially problematic as the Fed announced last week that a recession is expected in the coming months. Several decades of economics research shows that workers turn to independent work after they have faced a loss of income or unemployment. Recent reports using IRS tax data also found that independent work opportunities are critical for financially strained workers when they face economic hardship. At a time when employment opportunities are likely to become scarcer, it's unwise for the DOL to also limit independent work opportunities. Eliminating independent work will mean that workers will be unemployed for longer periods, thereby risking a far more severe recession. But perhaps the most unfortunate consequences of the DOL's rule is how it will adversely impact women. Across nationwide survey, women who are primary caregivers have indicated that they engage in independent work because they require flexible work arrangements. Indeed, one survey found that a quarter of women left their employment jobs to take on independent work because they wanted flexibility or needed more time to care for a child, parent, or other relative. Restricting independent work opportunities and reclassifying them into traditional employment would disadvantage many women who turn specifically to independent work for the flexibility that they need in their work schedules. There are far better ways to address the challenges of independent work without DOL regulations making women their collateral damage. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next witness is Ms. Padine.
Chair Kiley, Ranking Member Adams, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Laura Padine, and I'm the Director of Work Structures at the National Employment Law Project, a nonprofit organization that promotes policies and programs that create good jobs and strengthen upward mobility. True independent contractors are people who are in business for themselves. They determine what goods or services to sell and at what prices, make capital investments to grow their business, and build a customer base. At NELP, we support policies that ensure these small business owners are treated fairly. What we take issue with is when corporations mislabel the workers powering their businesses as independent contractors, or gig workers, or freelancers, even though these workers aren't in business for themselves. Employers that engage in these sham practices depress wages and working conditions and shed responsibility for their workers while maintaining control over key decisions, such as where, how, and for how much money workers perform their jobs. Congress passed our bedrock labor and employment laws because it recognized there's a profound imbalance of power in most employment relationships, and that absent government regulation, employers can force substandard working conditions on their workers under threat of poverty and loss of livelihood. As you know, because independent contractors are in business for themselves, they are not covered by our labor and employment protections, like the right to minimum wage and overtime, and the right to our harassment and discrimination-free workplace. and they don't have access to employment-based social insurance programs like unemployment insurance and workers' comp. In addition to losing out on these rights and benefits, a majority of so-called independent contractors earn little money. I say so-called because, by and large, those in low-earning professions, like janitors, nail salon workers, delivery workers, and home care workers, are not actually running their own businesses, but rather accepting working conditions imposed on them by the businesses misclassifying them. A growing body of research, which I cite in my written testimony, also shows that middle and low-earning independent contractors are making less money than employees in the same industries. Several studies have also found that app-based drivers and delivery workers are making just at or under the minimum wage for the localities where they live. It's important to emphasize these jobs are dangerous and difficult. Car and bike accidents are really common for folks doing this work. They have no workers' compensation, no paid time off, no employer-provided health insurance if they get sick or injured on the job, no unemployment insurance if they lose work. For many independent contractors, their poverty-level incomes and lack of benefits and protections mean that their lives and the lives of their families are incredibly precarious. They live paycheck to paycheck, one accident or illness away from financial disaster, and without the means to ever take a break from work or retire. Misclassification is especially prevalent in labor-intensive, low-wage sectors, where employers can gain a competitive advantage by driving down payroll costs. People of color and women are overrepresented in many of these sectors, shunted into jobs that are insecure, underpaid, and have no workplace protections or benefits. When regulators don't crack down on employers that misclassify their workers, and when policymakers interpret independent contractor to encompass low-wage, precarious occupations where people of color and other vulnerable populations are overrepresented, we at NELP worry that we are recreating racist carve-outs from our laws and allowing the creation of a second-tier class of workers who are predominantly people of color and women making poverty wages and excluded from basic employment rights and protections. I want to briefly raise 4 other issues. First, misclassification is hurting businesses that play by the rules. Employers who misclassify their workers pocket between 20 to 40% of payroll costs. So businesses that are doing the right thing and classifying their workers as employees are at an unfair disadvantage. Second, misclassification is hurting federal and state government coffers with billions in unpaid taxes and contributions to social insurance programs. Third, the issue of scheduling flexibility is a red herring. Employees can enjoy scheduling flexibility and they need not trade in bedrock labor protections to get it. Many employees, including shift workers, are now getting the scheduling flexibility they need, including choosing their hours, working shorter schedules, and signing up for shifts on apps. And lastly, I want to address something Ms. McCutcheon said. She said the DOL could unilaterally impose any test it wants for determining who is an independent contractor and who is an employee, including the ABC test if it wants. That's simply untrue. The test the DOL uses must be based on Supreme Court precedent, and indeed the 6-factor test the DOL has proposed is based on Supreme Court and Circuit Court precedent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final witness is Ms. Kaplan.
Thank you, Chairman Kiley and Ranking Member Adams, for the opportunity to address the committee today. I'm a 50-year-old freelance writer and editor from New Jersey. After 10 years as a staff editor for newspapers and magazines, I decided to freelance. I've been successful and happy in this career for 20 years. Being an independent contractor is my chosen way of working, as it is for tens of millions of Americans. A few years ago, I couldn't have even told you who all my elected officials were. But then in 2019, California passed Assembly Bill 5. That law snowballed into a shocking series of events that include me testifying here today. California's law used language called the ABC test to strictly redefine who can and cannot earn income as an independent contractor. This ABC test is, quite frankly, impossible for many legitimate independent contractors to pass. Freelancers in California immediately began losing their income and their careers. And yet, Almost overnight, my own state of New Jersey tried to fast-track a copycat of the California bill. So, several of us freelance writers created Fight for Freelancers to protect our careers. We blanketed the media with op-eds and interviews, and in a matter of weeks, our group swelled to thousands of members from many professions. We then packed our state house to standing room only capacity, and we testified for more than 4 hours until lawmakers understood that our careers as legitimate independent contractors need protection. Thankfully, the New Jersey bill died. But then, members of Congress ignored the chaos on the West Coast and the outcry on the East Coast and began work to advance this same ABC test nationwide with the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. At that point, every independent contractor in America, tens of millions of us, had our livelihoods in the crosshairs. It's been more than 3 years now since California's law went into effect, and the lesson could not be clearer. Attempts to restrict the choice of self-employment do not create lots of new jobs. When you rewrite the rules to misclassify legitimate independent contractors, you destroy our income and careers. I'm here today to ask for your help in stopping these attacks on Americans like me. We are grateful that a few Senate Democrats joined with Republicans in the last term and refused to pass the PRO Act, but we remain deeply concerned that the same ABC test language remains in that bill now. We're also disturbed by recent actions at the U.S. Labor Department, which is rewriting its independent contractor standard in a way that will misclassify legitimate independent contractors. The current nominee to lead that department, Julie Su, supported and enforced the California law. It's remarkable to me that such a freelance-busting ideologue would even be considered for the nation's top workforce protection job. In the face of all these threats to our livelihoods, our grassroots, nonpartisan Fight for Freelancers coalition only keeps growing. We're now a national force. Our recent amicus briefs, including one that we wrote for the U.S. Supreme Court, were co-signed on behalf of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And make no mistake about who we are. Our members have voted for everybody from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump. All of our co-founders and about 80% of our members are women. Our members include senior citizens, Generation Z, people of color, people with disabilities, union supporters, and just about every other demographic you can imagine. All of us are united on this issue. American citizens have had the right to hang out a shingle and go into business for ourselves since the day this nation was founded. It's a right that a third of the workforce, including me, exercises every day. Please fight for freelancers and protect our right to choose self-employment. I see that I have 30 seconds left. I'd like to speak directly to you, Ranking Member Adams. You said something that was correct in your opening statement. You said misclassification harms our economy. I agree with you, ma'am, and I hope we can have a conversation today about just how much harm it's going to do our economy if you misclassify tens of millions of Americans like me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kevin. Under Committee Rule 9, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule, starting with Mr. Grothman.
Oh, are you? Okay. Thank you. It's great being at this subcommittee today. We have 2 American flags in the room. I always kind of like to look at the American flag. You know, to me it signifies freedom. And I'd like to apologize to Mrs. Cavan. We're so close here to taking away your freedom to make a living the way you want to make a living. It's too bad there's so many arrogant people who think they know better how you should live your life than you want to live your life. And it's just so un-American. It's sickening to me. But they're in positions of power, so we got to look out. Was it Ronald Reagan who said freedom is only one generation from extinction? Yeah, so we have here these people. Okay, now I like, we're going to give a go here. We think she's so wonderful. We're going to try to pronounce her name. Ms. Palagashvili. Okay. The Department of Labor only acknowledges one category of costs, and what it calls one-time regulatory familiarization rules in its independent contractor proposed rule. Labor also implausibly asserts that the proposed rule is not expected to impose costs after the first year. Department of Labor is suggesting that somehow reclassifying a large number of workers who choose and prefer to be independent contractors would only impose costs in the first year of the rule. Do you find Labor's cost assessment of its rule to be realistic?
Thank you for your question. It's a great question. The Department of Labor did not provide a reasoned determination of the costs and benefits of this rule. And as you stated, they provided only one cost of the rule, but they missed a very, very, very important cost. They actually implicitly assumed in their analysis that 100% of impacted jobs, contracting jobs, would automatically turn into employment jobs, and that is unrealistic, and it's not grounded in any economics research, and actually the economics research that we do have show that jobs will actually be lost. We also have anecdotal evidence from California's AB5, but one study did a simulation that said this type of rule would be equivalent to losing 58% of these earning opportunities to 87% of earning opportunities. Now, this is a pretty important aspect the Department of Labor missed, and it does not allow them to do a proper cost-benefit analysis of the rule. So they were able to treat everything as mere transfers, and there was no real cost analysis in this rule.
Okay. The California experiment with the ABC worker classification test is showing that it's economically disruptive. Do you know percentage-wise, can you take a wild stab or somebody else up here, on the number of people, this is the way they currently earn their money, who are, is a practical matter, it's not really their job, it's their business, kind of a hybrid of a job or a business, self-employed people. How many are going to, in essence, have to lose their income?
Could you clarify your question? How
Okay.
many in California
If you're an
lost their
independent
income?
contractor,
Yep.
you know, you're getting I guess a 1099, right? Percentage-wise, some people will wind up being traditional employees. A lot of people, this new way of classifying people or forbidding people to be classified as independent contractors means they'll in essence be out of work. Does anybody take a guess how many people wind up, in essence, losing their income stream because of this high-handed proposal?
So there isn't a great economics research study on this. There is a simulation that was done, and as I mentioned, it's about 58% to 87% of job losses with this. And so essentially what's happening is that a majority of these workers from this estimate will neither become employees nor be able to work in their independent contracting roles because you make that role illegal.
So we take a wild stab, we could say 2/3 of the people who are currently independent contractors are going to be out of work. And some will be forced to become employees, which they don't want to, which is a punishment in its own right. But 65% are going to have to find something else to do, huh?
That is an estimate that we do have. It's not the best, but it's one of the only ones that we do have that show that. And by the way, I just want to highlight again, there were hundreds of news stories about AB5 job losses. It wasn't 1, 2, or 3, it was hundreds.
I think a lot of women, and this was kind of mentioned by one of the other witnesses, but a lot of women, kind of because their position, would rather have the flexibility an independent contractor role has. Would you say that this rule disproportionately punishes women?
I have written about how this rule does disproportionately impact women, and that's because for the majority of women who choose independent work, we see this across surveys, they say they voluntarily leave employment to go into independent work opportunities. And this is especially true for women who are primary caregivers in their homes. And so in that regard, yes, this rule will disproportionately harm women who are primary caregivers.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I will now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses again for joining us this morning. I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Construction Employers of America expressing support for the proposed rule on independent contractors.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'm addressing my questions to Ms. Padden. We hear a lot of mention of flexibility when it comes to employee misclassification. Employers claim that in being classified as employees, workers won't have access to flexible work conditions. And as a mother and a grandmother, I am sensitive to the fact that our workers need flexibility to care for loved ones, be it a child who has not yet started school or someone who has fallen ill or even to care for themselves. So I want to ask a few questions to ensure that we have the facts here. Ms. Padden, first, does employee status necessarily mean that workers cannot enjoy flexibility?
No, it does not.
Mr. Long, do you agree? Is that a yes? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Padden, for confirming that there are opportunities whereby employees can be properly classified and access flexible career choice. As a follow-up to that point, I'm interested in having a robust conversation with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle about how we can cultivate and nurture a workforce that protects and benefits all workers. So, Ms. Padden, if our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are fully interested in helping America's workers enjoy more flexibility, what are some policies that we could adopt that would give employees more flexibility in their day-to-day lives?
Thank you, Representative Adams. I would say there's the Schedules at Work Act, federal legislation that would ensure that workers have the right to request scheduling changes, and it would also include anti-retaliation protections for making such requests for flexibility, and schedules and pay and it would ensure schedules and pay that are stable and predictable. There's also the Healthy Families Act, legislation that would establish a federal guarantee of 1 hour of earned sick time for every 30 hours worked. I think it's really important to note that true flexibility has to include financial stability. It has to include the ability to take paid time off, to have some compensation. For so many workers, they're balancing their income against every hour they're earning, right? So they either work or they don't get paid. So really, these two pieces of legislation would do that.
Great, thank you. You know, I've been a long-time supporter of many of the measures that you mentioned and look forward to continuing conversations with my colleagues throughout the 118th Congress on these important issues. But Ms. Padden, the Economic Policy Institute estimates that housekeeping cleaners lose about more than $5,000 a year, and home health and personal care aides lose about $6,000 per year when they are misclassified, and they lose access to legal protections, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation. And so for these workers and many others, the way they are classified is not something within their control, is it?
That's correct. It's not in their control.
So if the balance of power to make that determination lies with their employees, is that correct?
With their employers, yes, that's correct.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your responses. Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize Ms. Miller.
Thank you. The independent contracting model benefits workers and job creators. Independent contractors have advantages over traditional employees. They have the flexibility to choose their own hours, projects, and clients, giving them the freedom to control their own careers and work-life balances. It's no wonder that 80% of self-employed independent contractors prefer their current status. This is why President Biden's attack on them is so egregious. We need independent contractors, especially in the trucking industry, where they are so vital to our national supply chain. Again, I want to thank the committee for holding this hearing, and I yield my remaining time to Chair Kiley.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Ms. Anderson, you have worked with many freelancers, independent contractors, entrepreneurs in California who have been negatively impacted by AB 5, which President Biden has cited as his model for labor relations in the United States. I believe AB 5 has now created over 100 different exemptions of one kind or another. Is that correct?
It's debatable whether all of those exemptions are actually can practically be taken advantage of, but technically, yes, 100.
And so in practice, the way this worked was you had, after the law was signed, you had all of these massive job losses that were occurring. And so it set off this lobbying frenzy where industries tried to get themselves out of the law. And, as chaotic as that process was, as was noted in the testimony, it did end up saving some jobs, at least. Ms. Cavan, does the Department of Labor rule that's being proposed have any of those exemptions?
No, sir, nor does the PRO Act.
So in other words, even those industries that were spared by AB 5 would be ensnared by the PRO Act or the Department of Labor rule.
That is the goal of the way these regulations are being written. Their purpose is to capture as many legitimate independent contractors as they can, simply to force us out of work.
And as I mentioned at the outset, because we have the AB 5 experience, it's not like we need to sit here and hypothesize about what the impact of these new or legal standards being proposed are going to be. So I thought I'd give you an opportunity, Ms. Anderson, if you had a few stories you'd like to share of independent contractors who have lost their livelihoods in California.
Yes, thank you so much for allowing me to share some of these stories. Nancy Hall is a licensed pharmacist in her 60s, and she has a doctorate degree. And her longtime freelance career of performing compliance inspections of pharmacies up and down the state was destroyed overnight by AB 5. Now, this is somebody that, why is it that licensed psychologists have an exemption, but a licensed pharmacist does not? We have an independent filmmaker, Margarita Reyes. She faces restrictions with hosting youth mentoring programs in marginalized communities. We have lots of stories of people that have had to flee the state because of life-threatening situations. One gal, she was a freelance bookkeeper, and she had to flee the state with her autistic son and her very ill husband, who had stage 4 colon cancer, when she lost her freelance bookkeeping career overnight that solely supported her family. Gail Gordon she founded her nonprofit opera company in honor of her mother, who was a Holocaust survivor, and her opera company presented music by Jewish composers suppressed by the Nazis. Well, she got audited. She passed her audit, I don't know how, but she had to shutter her opera because it's not possible for these performing arts companies to operate under AB 5. And they were a lot of the theaters and children's theaters and small performing arts groups, they were closing their doors long before the COVID shutdowns happened. We have a RN, Lori Blanc. She's a nurse educator, and she's legally disabled with 35 benign bone tumors on her body. And she lost her career to AB 5 because nurse educators are not exempt, but yet doctors are. We have a gal named Judith Flex Hella, who shared with our group that AB 5 has killed the concert dance scene in Los Angeles. A lot of what we're hearing from these performing arts communities is that they could survive COVID eventually, but they can't survive AB 5. They cannot afford to convert every single person into an employee, because it's going to raise the cost of a single production by almost up to 40 to 50%.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Those are such heartbreaking and compelling stories. I hope we can return to some more of them later in the hearing. And we know that there would be millions more like this if these new proposals went into effect. I'll now recognize Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to begin by stressing the Workforce Protections Subcommittee does not have jurisdiction over state laws such as AB 5 or cabinet nominations such as acting Secretary Sue's. I find it perplexing but not surprising by the committee Republicans' very first Workforce Protection Subcommittee hearing is conveniently scheduled to take place just one day before the Senate confirmation hearing of Ms. Julie Sue. I was proud to lead 14 of my other House Democratic colleagues in a letter supporting her for the top position at DOL back in 2020, and in my mind there's no one more qualified for the position than Ms. Sue. But as we've seen, this committee under Republican control is far more focused on gearing attention towards stopping one woman from getting a job instead of helping all Americans receive the wages that they've earned. The chairman of this very committee has gone so far as to send out this tweet claiming that Ms. Sue was the architect of legislation, AB 5, and I would like to ask unanimous consent to include a copy of this tweet in the official record.
Without objection.
As someone who has the honor of representing California here in Congress and someone who knows Julie Sue and strongly supports her confirmation as Secretary of Labor, I want to set the record straight on a couple of things. First, my question is for Ms. Padin. Does the proposed rule from the Biden administration on misclassification adopt the ABC test?
It does not.
In fact, the proposed rule even says, does it not, on page 62,230 of the Federal Register notice that, quote, the department continues to believe that legal limitations prevent the department from adopting, end quote, the ABC test. Is that right?
That's correct.
And a final rule must, in accordance with the Administrative Procedure Act, be a logical outgrowth of what was put out in the proposed rule. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And we're not going to see DOL using the ABC test for Fair Labor Standards Act cases, are we?
That's correct.
So this is a misleading, the committee is pursuing, the Republicans on this committee are pursuing a misleading conflation of issues here, are they not?
That's correct. The DOL rule is a 6-factor test. It is not the ABC test.
So the DOL rule is a 6-factor test, not the ABC test. So
Correct.
So it seems to me there's a lot of conflation, obfuscating the real issue here, what the administration is attempting to do. You wish to respond?
Yes, I agree with you. This DOL rule adopts 6 factors that get at the kind of central issue of whether a worker is in business for themselves or in the business of someone else. 6 common sense factors that are based on Supreme Court precedent. It does not use the ABC test.
Well, in my time remaining, I'd like to speak directly about Ms. Sue, who is the daughter of immigrants. Her mother came to the United States on a cargo ship because she could not afford a passenger ticket. She has spent her whole career fighting to improve the lives of working people, and I believe she represents the best of America. That is why in February, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus sent a letter to President Biden urging him to nominate Julie Sue as Labor Secretary. I ask unanimous consent to enter that letter into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
And since the President nominated Ms. Sue, a diverse coalition of folks have come forward to endorse her. For instance, the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce has voiced support for Ms. Sue's nomination as Labor Secretary, and I ask unanimous consent to enter their statement into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
This question I have is for Mr. Long. Mr. Long, I understand that the National Electrical Contractors Association has endorsed Julie Sue. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And did your organization send a letter in support of her nomination?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the National Electrical Contractors Association letter in support of Ms. Julie Sue into the record.
Without objection.
Ms. Padin, I understand that the National Employment Law Project endorsed Julie Sue as well. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Committee Republicans I don't know if I have your letter here. Do I have your letter as well? So I wish to enter, Mr. Chairman, ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the National Employment Law Project letter.
Without objection.
Committee Republicans are wrong about the Biden-Harris administration's rule, and they're wrong about Julie Sue. They're unfairly smearing her in this committee. I'm proud to support both the rule and Acting Secretary Julie Sue's nomination. I yield back my time.
I will now recognize the chair of the Education and Workforce Committee, Dr. Virginia Fox.
Thank you, Chairman Kiley. I appreciate it, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. Ms. McCutcheon, a federal district court overturned the Biden Department of Labor's first attempt to withdraw the Trump administration's independent contractor rule, and therefore the Trump DOL's independent contractor rule is still in effect. In spite of this, are you aware of any instances where DOL has ignored the independent contractor rule that is still on the books and determined a worker's classification using a different test than what the law requires?
Yes, two things. One, you can't find those regulations anywhere on the DOL's website. Their misclassification page instead links to Fact Sheet 13, which lists the 6 factors that have not been the law for over 2 years. So they're misleading the public about what the actual law is. Second, I actually represent a nurse registry business in Florida in a current DOL investigation. We had a closing conference not a month ago, and in that closing conference, despite the fact that the Trump regulations are in effect, the solicitor and the investigator went through the 6 factors and did not at all apply or attempt to apply the 2021 regulations.
That is a very serious situation, and I intend to follow up on it. Ms. Gavin, you've spent the last few years volunteering your time to advocate against restrictive worker classification tests at the state and federal levels. During this time, what's been your experience interacting with federal and state lawmakers and regulators who are seeking to implement policies that would destroy your career?
I have had lawmakers laugh in my face. They have ignored us by the dozens in public hearings. They have refused to give us a seat at the table when they are writing regulations about us. Perhaps most egregiously, we have been told that if we want to see any changes in the language of the legislation that we're questioning and challenging, that we can't even discuss it with our elected officials. We have to discuss it with the AFL-CIO. I have numerous examples in my written testimony of things that we have endured these past few years. I'll share one brief story with you here now. We did a phone call with the top aide on the PRO Act to U.S. Senator Patty Murray. It was the 4 co-leaders of Fight for Freelancers, all of us women. One of them is a working mom named Karen Morin from Georgia. And Karen explained to this aide that in the previous year, as a freelance writer, she'd had about 30 different clients, and she was able to manage her couple of kids, the carpools, the Girl Scout cookies, all the things that she does, because she was her own boss and she could work with those people as she pleased. Karen then explained to this aide that the best case scenario, forget about her income being wiped out, but the best case scenario, if this ABC test goes nationwide, is she now has 30 part-time bosses. And she asked this aide, how is a human being supposed to do anything with 30 part-time bosses? How could you schedule so much as a bathroom break, let alone function? And this aide said to us, I have no problem with that outcome.
Oh. Well, thank you very much. Ms. Palagashvili, in your comment letter on DOL's proposed independent contractor rule, you wrote that, quote, DOL implicitly assumes that 100% of potential contracting jobs will be turned into employment jobs. This seems hard to believe. Are you aware of any economic research that supports DOL's assumptions?
Thank you for your question. No, there's no economic research that supports the DOL's implicit assumption that there will be 0 contracting losses.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I only have 30 seconds, but if you can use them, you're welcome to them.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Ms. Gavin, did President Biden cite AB5's ABC test as his model for labor relations?
He ran on it. If you go to joebiden.com/empoweredworkers, it's right there on his website. He says he plans to work with Congress to make the ABC test the basis for all labor, employment, and tax law.
And is the ABC test in the PRO Act?
Yes, it is. It's right at the top.
And do you believe that the practical impact of the Department of Labor rule will be similar to the ABC test?
They have made clear in their own words that they think the ABC test is great, and they're trying to get as close to it as they can without the Supreme Court stopping them.
Thank you very much. I will now recognize Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before our subcommittee today. The misclassification of workers as independent contractors is certainly a pervasive issue affecting a host of workers and their families with national implications. And fortunately, the Michigan State Legislature, I'm a representative from the Great Lakes state is taking concrete action to address this problem. This month, they are taking up a series of bills, one of which cracks down on this type of payroll fraud by prohibiting the misclassification of employees as independent contractors, in addition to shifting the burden of proof to employers facing complaints that they've misclassified workers. So let's be clear. When it comes to worker misclassification, there are many losers and only one winner. And that is the employer who adopts misclassification as a business model to gain an unfair competitive advantage over other law-abiding businesses, costing billions in lost tax revenue each year by shortchanging workers and what they are owed. This lost revenue, which our Republican colleagues appear wholly satisfied to see continue, corrodes key programs like Social Security and Medicare. And an interesting point as we are heading into budget debates and negotiations. This shouldn't come as a surprise, however, that our House Republican colleague members right now are making this argument. And so, Ms. Padine, from your testimony, it appears data have been spotty over the years as to the extent of misclassification. What are we able to glean from this data on the prevalence of misclassification?
Thank you for your question. So most of the recent data on the prevalence of misclassification is coming from states that have created interagency task force to study this issue. And they have shown that the prevalence is vast. Studies in Illinois estimate over 350,000 workers are misclassified. In New York, it's over 250,000. In Pennsylvania, it's 500,000. It's important to emphasize these state-level studies are usually based on unemployment insurance tax audits of employers registered in the UI program, but these UI audits are rarely identifying employers who fail to report any worker payments to state authorities or workers paid completely off the books. So the critical point here is that they're missing a large portion of the misclassified workforce. So the studies are showing that misclassification is a huge problem, but they're still very likely understating the scope of the problem.
And so how would more current and comprehensive national data help us combat employee misclassification?
So we absolutely need more data here. It would be useful in so many ways, including giving us insight into the occupations and industries where misclassification is prevalent so agencies know where to focus their attention and resources. It would provide information on what misclassification is costing, what it's costing in terms of cost to transfer to misclassified workers, what it costs to law-abiding businesses, and what it costs to the government in terms of lost social insurance contributions.
And you touched on this briefly in your testimony, but could you extrapolate further? What are consequences for workers when they are misclassified?
So they are vast. I mean, in addition to losing out on all employment-based rights and protections, right to minimum wage, right to collectively bargain, social insurance programs like workers' comp and unemployment insurance, there's a growing body of research showing that low and middle earning independent contractors are even making less money than employees in the same industry.
And are there impacts to retirement?
Yes, that's huge. So these folks if they have to pay into Social Security themselves, right? So they're paying both the employer and the employee share of Social Security, and they don't have access to any employer provided benefits.
Yeah,
like
so it's
pensions or
costing them
401ks.
money. And
Huge.
Recently, Bloomberg News had an article that a good chunk of people 59 and older don't have anything saved for retirement. I think the number was close to 60%. So by putting into place some of the better labor practices, don't you think we'd better position people for retirement if we start classifying workers properly?
We absolutely better position people for retirement, yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I recognize Mr. Burleson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Cavan, I believe I'm pronouncing that right. I want to applaud, your effort and you have a great resume here, but as the founder of the Fight for Freelancers, and especially in telling your story, it appears to me, in listening to some of these hearings, and I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question, but it appears that the people testifying in the position of the Biden administration is that you just simply are not making good decisions for yourself in choosing to be a contractor. Is that the case?
Not only that, but I think it's noteworthy that in literally every hearing I have attended, whether at the state levels in New Jersey and California or at the federal levels, the USDOL hearings last summer, the U.S. Small Business Administration Office of Advocacy hearings last summer, the vast majority of participants who are actual independent contractors are screaming no and saying stop. The people who are showing up to push this on us are people like union lawyers, like the woman sitting next to me.
So I've got to think in your position, it would be extremely demeaning to be told that you're not intelligent enough, basically, is what's being told, to make the decision that's best for you.
What we see among the members of our group, they tend to go through something like the stages of grief. When they first find out what's going on, their first response is disbelief. There's no way the government could be trying to take away my income. Who am I bothering? I'm not doing anything wrong. Then they go and try to talk to their lawmakers, and they get the door slammed in their face. Then it turns to shock. Then it turns to anger. If they have voted in the past for a lot of Democrats, their next emotion is betrayal. We see it all the time. And at that point, they're ready to fight. They're ready to stand up and fight for their careers. So yes, sir, we do feel quite disturbed by this whole thing, and we do intend to continue fighting for our rights to choose self-employment.
So I don't know if you can see this from where you're at, but this is a photo and a website about a new constituent of mine. Her name is Dee Sova. She was a resident of California, and she has an amazing record. She has 27 years experience as a truck driver. All of which there's no accidents involved, like millions of miles without having an accident. She is a member of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. She established a organization called Trucking Divas Rock, okay? This is a community leader. This is someone that any state would be proud to have as a constituent. And I happen to be the lucky community that got her because of the failed policies that California implemented. And to me, the idea that she is not capable of making good decisions for her and her family is what's ridiculous. I think it's demeaning to this woman who is a minority business owner, who is successful, has been extremely successful, for us to basically jerk her around, make her up her family and move to an entirely new state because we want to get more people on union dues, right?
Not only that, sir, UCLA Health put out a study less than a year ago. Self-employed women, 43% lower risk of high blood pressure, 34% lower risk of reporting obesity, 30% lower risk of reporting diabetes compared to women who work for salaries and wages. Self-employed women were also more likely to report exercising and having a lower body mass index. I don't think that's a shock to anybody, right? You get to be your own boss, you get to be in charge of your own life, you get to choose what happens to you every day, day in and day out. You feel a lot better, and you do a lot better.
Thank you. I'm going to butcher your name, Miss
Okay.
Palagashvili.
That's good. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so as an economist, you talked about the impact on the economy. Can you elaborate, especially when there's a 64% chance, according to people that are studying the economy, that we are facing a recession. Can you describe the impact of if we get into a recession and jobs are hard to find, of now there's not an option for people to become independent contractors?
Thank you for your question. And I just want to add a little note here that the DOL rule will lead to significantly fewer independent work opportunities. And the way it will do that is in two ways. One, it makes it illegal for some freelancers to continue being freelancers because of the way that the DOL has written the law. And the second way it does that is even if an independent contractor is properly classified under the new DOL rule, the rule itself adds so much confusion, complexity, that it would deter small organizations from working with independent contractors altogether because they don't have extensive legal counsel to rely on to say, hey, is this person, properly classified or not? And that's exactly why the Small Business Administration wrote a letter to the Department of Labor saying we have grave concerns about this rule for small business owners. Now, what that means is...
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize Ms. Omar.
Yep.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Ms. Badin, are you a union lawyer? And also, is there anything that you'd like to respond if I gave you a few minutes?
No, I'll just correct the record on that. I am not a union lawyer. I work for a nonprofit. I am a union member, though.
I was as well. And I just want to say, Michigan is considering updating its laws. Minnesota is too. And we've had so many gig workers out rallying to get protection. So I really don't know when it's being said here in this hearing that there are only people with a special interest or unions that are advocating for this. We hear it from constituents regularly. You cited DOL data that showed up to 95% of workers who claim to be misclassified should have legally been considered employees. I agree with you. Misclassification is a widely spread problem in our country, likely affecting millions of workers, and it is a shame that our Republican colleagues are not taking it seriously. According to the Minnesota Attorney General's office, as many as 20% of employers misclassify at least one employee. Last October, Minnesota's AG filed a lawsuit against gig economy company Shipt for misclassifying delivery workers to avoid fair wage and hour laws. Ms. Benton, could you explain what industries are particularly liable for independent contractor misclassification and how it harms these workers?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So, misclassification rates are disproportionately high in low-wage, labor-intensive industries. That's including construction, home care, trucking, janitorial work, and app-based work like ride-hail and delivery. Many of these jobs are known for being, and many of these jobs are low-wage, labor-intensive jobs where the work is disproportionately being done by people of color and women.
Thank you. And I know that in this committee we like to vilify unions and union members, but union membership is vital to supporting better wages and safer workplace for all workers. It's also beneficial to small businesses who see an impact in employee retention and improvement in their ability to compete with large corporations. Sadly, a decline in unionization has caused the average full-time worker over $3,000 in lost earnings per year, according to the Economic Policy Institute. Workers should be given the freedom to unionize and receive the full wages and benefits they deserve. Attacks on organizing workers are only putting good faith employers at a competitive disadvantage and taking money out of taxpayers' pockets. Can you explain how union benefits workers and employees alike, and why would the PRO Act and the proposed DOL rulemaking help cut down the economic cost of misclassification?
Sure. There's many studies showing that union members make more money than non-unionized workers, that they have better benefits, and they have more economic security. They have health care, they have pensions, they have retirement benefits. So the benefits to workers of unionization are quite large. I would also just say here, a lot has been said about AB 5 and conflating it with the PRO Act. And yes, they both use the ABC test for purposes of determining who's covered. But they're very different laws. PRO Act would use the ABC test for determining who's covered under the National Labor Relations Act, our federal law that provides a right for employees to engage in concerted action. It's the right to band together with your fellow coworkers to advocate for improvements in the terms and conditions of employment. So adopting the ABC test would ensure that more people have this right. But it's your choice whether to exercise that right. If you don't want to engage in concerted action with your fellow coworkers and improve your workplace, then don't. If you don't want to join a union, then don't organize your workplace. This is all about expanding the choices available to workers, not the obligations.
Appreciate you. Thank you for your testimony and for your time. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to use my time today to look more closely at President Biden's selection of Julie Su, an architect and lead enforcer of AB 5, to be his next Secretary of Labor. This nomination truly boggles the mind. It would be hard to find a state official with a greater record of mismanagement than Julie Su had in California. The work of Su and her department were subject to scathing bipartisan criticism in California by the Democrat supermajority in that state. During the COVID shutdowns, you had many people who were unable to get their unemployment checks. It was I was a state lawmaker. It was the number one thing that occupied my office is folks who were told they were not able to work, who were entitled to unemployment benefits, and who had to wait weeks, months, sometimes indefinitely just to get those benefits because of the mismanagement of the EDD, California's unemployment office, which fell within Julie Su's department. And yet, at the same time, you had her department, that agency, the EDD, that was sending out checks to hardened criminals in the largest fraud of taxpayer dollars in state history, amounting to what's estimated to be $32 billion in fraud. And this, too, has been subject to scathing reports by the independent state auditor in California and has been subject to harsh bipartisan criticism. There is really no predicting what the consequences would be if that level of mismanagement was brought to the top post at the United States Department of Labor. But there is predicting what would happen if her approach to AB 5 were nationalized. And one of the things that we saw in California, Ms. Anderson, is that as bad as AB 5 is on its face, Ms. Su was able to use her role as the enforcer of the law to make it even more destructing. Can you tell us a little bit about what the folks that you've worked with in California experienced?
Well, during the pandemic, they doubled down on these audits on small businesses that were already struggling or actually dead in the water from the shutdowns. Instead of suspending audits, these ruthless, aggressive audits on moms and pops and single business people, she doubled down on these audits. And a lot of people actually, were dragged through the mud for a year and ended up passing their audit, but it put them out, the whole process put them out of business anyways. All you have to do is read the scathing report from the state auditor from 2021 about Julie Su's unprecedented mismanagement of the EDD and the fraud fiasco that she oversaw. It's inexplicable that she would be worthy of a promotion. It's also inexplicable that she said, quote, AB 5 is a model for the nation. I mean, anybody, Democrat, Republican, or independent, or anyone in between who has been a victim of AB 5 in California, and there's hundreds of thousands of us, if not millions, would just find that to be a disqualifying statement. She was labor commissioner from 2011 to 2018, and then she became the head of the EDD from 2019 to 2022. So she's all about enforcement. And so that's going to be what will be her focus if she were to be made the top labor secretary. And also, she tried to entrap independent contractors into applying for unemployment insurance benefits, even though they're not qualified traditionally for that. And if they were to do that and name their client as their employer, it would trigger an automatic audit on these businesses and these hiring entities. And that's what started to play out in our group when I started getting stories and calls from small business owners and moms and pops who were being audited aggressively by the EDD during the pandemic.
So I just want to get this straight. You had, we all remember the lockdowns that when happened in California and across the country. You had millions of people put out of work. And at this very moment, Julie Su decides it's her priority to devote resources to enforcing a law that's going to put even more people out of work. Is that what happened?
Well, beginning of 2020, after AB 5 went into effect, there was $20 million allocated by Governor Newsom to, to the enforcement of AB 5.
And small businesses who were on their last legs were subject to audits. And these audits were done, by the way, by EDD personnel. Is that right?
That's correct. I have an example of a single woman of color who owned a platform in San Diego that connected independent contractor referees and umpires with local schools and referees. Local schools and sports leagues. And the lawyer fees alone put her out of business before referees and umpires received a last-minute exemption in the cleanup bill in September of 2020. But it was too late for her and her business. And she was dragged through the mud during the entirety of the pandemic. That right. Audit went on for over a year, and she actually ended up passing it.
Thank you very much. And these are the personnel that could have been used to get people their unemployment checks or to stop fraud from happening, were instead used to conduct harassing audits and put even more people out of work. I'll now recognize Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Padine, let's just get back to what we're talking about. The independent contractors, as opposed to employees, are independent contractors guaranteed minimum wage and overtime?
They are not.
But employees are?
Yes.
And what about if you lose your job through no fault of your own, or independent contractors covered by unemployment insurance?
They are not.
But employees are?
Yes.
What about if you're hurt on the job? Do you get workers' compensation if you're an independent contractor?
No.
Or employees?
Yes, they can.
Okay. Now, if you are independent contractors entitled to benefits awarded to other employees of the business in terms of health care, pensions, and sick leave?
No.
But the employees of the business are entitled to those benefits?
Yes.
In states that require paid sick days, are independent contractors covered?
No.
Are independent covered, are they covered by paid family leave if that's passed on a state level?
No.
What about health and safety protections under OSHA? Are independent contractors covered?
No, I don't believe so.
Now, are employers required to pay the employer portion of Social Security for independent contractors?
No.
Independent contractors, they have a right to join a union?
No.
And so if the employees are relieved of all of that, how much money can the business save by misclassifying a worker as an independent contractor rather than an employee?
Estimates put it at about 20 to 40% of payroll costs employers can pocket if they misclassify workers.
Mr. Long, how does that give a business an unfair competitive advantage if they misclassify employees?
Well, I want to start off by saying the National Electrical Contractors is a pro-business organization. In fact, we have educational programs that help new entrepreneurs start a contracting firm, and we have educational programs to help our smaller firms. You know, a person who wants to be an independent contractor and create a business, we support 1,000%. A construction firm who may use the term independent contractor to build a workforce that is a huge negative impact on the financial burden of our contractors is something completely different. You know, a construction worker our workers back during COVID was deemed essential. Now, I don't want us to confuse flexibility with independent contracting. Our workforce works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week here in America, keeping our industry running. However, I am very concerned about the inability for independent contracting to allow the bypassing of OSHA regulations and federal and state compensation laws that become very much different on the bottom line of not only the taxpayers, but our contractor members and our workers.
Thank you. Why would somebody lose their job if they're classified as an employee?
They get worker benefits, unemployment benefits.
So the employer decides not to hire them just because they don't want to pay minimum wage, overtime, unemployment compensation, and the rest, and that's why they might lose their job?
That is correct.
Is there any restriction on flexibility? Can you get flexibility as an employee?
In our model, like I say, we are absolutely have workforce working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And our flexibility many times depends on the end user or the customer. However, our workers have the ability to work anytime at any working day. What is not avoided in that is deductions that are paid to the federal government and state taxes that would allow that worker to have workers' compensation if they're injured, or unemployment benefits if they're unemployed. And not only that, it gives us an opportunity to train our workforce in a more comprehensive manner.
Thank you. Ms. Padine, is there a difference between AB5 in California as implemented and the ABC test in general?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that
Is
question?
there a difference between California law AB5 as it was implemented and the ABC test in general?
Is there a difference between AB5 and the ABC test?
Right.
AB5 used the ABC test.
But it is implemented, were there differences that made life difficult in California that were not necessary by the ABC test?
I'm not sure if I understand that question. Can you say it one more time?
Are there things that were done in California that were not required by an ABC test?
I don't know. I'm not aware of that. I can get back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Yield back.
I'll now recognize Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. And this is deja vu all over again. It's gone on for years. And chairing this subcommittee myself for 6 years, this is a warm fuzzy producing debate issue that goes on here. And I think it'll continue, just coming from a hearing dealing with rural broadband and trying to mobilize that and get a workforce out there, in many cases independent contractors, et cetera, is a real challenge that we have. And so this is an important hearing to deal with. But we have to come to a conclusion and not doing whipsawing back and forth. Ms. McCutcheon, you state in your, and good to see you again, you state in your testimony that the war on the independent workforce is perpetuated by the chaos of the legal standards for determining who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. I have long supported legislation to provide certainty in our laws for entrepreneurs. Specifically, last Congress, I offered bipartisan legislation to clearly define direct sellers as independent contractors under the Fair Labor Standards Act, consistent with the Internal Revenue Service Code. I look forward to reintroducing this legislation this Congress, as well to include the entirety of the IRS Code section, which includes real estate agents as well. Ms. McCutcheon, how would harmonizing our federal laws help curb the legal attacks on independent contractors?
Well, because both workers and businesses would know exactly and have much better predictability of who is an independent contractor and who is an employee. And that can only be done by Congress to adopt a single rule under every federal statute, including the FLSA, which uses the reality test, which was created by the Supreme Court. But Congress can take us back to a common law test, which focuses on who controls the work, which is the key distinction between an independent contractor and an employee, is control and that flexibility.
It is a key distinction, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe not simple to understand, but it seems like a key distinction, yeah. Moving on, Ms. McCutcheon and
Palagashvili.
Okay, Billy. Forgive me for that. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal published how nursing shortages are driving innovation in digital platforms that enable nurses to work independently on their own terms. Specifically, The Wall Street Journal cites that many nurses across the country are not practicing because a traditional hospital and healthcare facility schedule does not fit their lives. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to support policies to codify a broad and vague standard for joint employment that would stifle this type of innovation and flexibility that workers are seeking and healthcare needs. What are your primary concerns with the Democrat joint employer standard as it pertains to business and workers alike, and shouldn't we be facilitating innovation, promoting flexibility?
Thank you for your question. My expertise is on the independent workforce, and I'm here to testify about the independent contractor rule from the Department of Labor. There are similarities, and one thing that is helpful to note here is that the healthcare workers who are independent workers would also be impacted by the Department of Labor independent contractor rule adversely. And actually, according to IRS tax data, healthcare is the second industry that's seen the greatest growth in independent contractors since 2001. And we've seen a lot of individuals go into healthcare as independent workers. And so that sector in particular, I've looked at that would be adversely impacted by the Department of Labor rule.
Ms. McCutcheon?
Especially in healthcare, what happens is nurses who want to be independent contractors take jobs in a hospital. And then the DOL finds that the hospital is a joint employer with whatever like market app they have. So first you get into, are they an employee, or yes, they're an employee, and by the way, the hospital isn't the employer, right? And so that means that hospitals trying to meet their staffing levels are
frustrated.
Yes.
And the patients are hurt.
Correct.
Thanks for your answers. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. And finally, I recognize Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 letters, one from the Sheet Metal and Air Conditioning Contractors National Association and one from the TAUC.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you for holding this hearing. Something that I know quite a bit about from my previous life as an electrician out in the field, and it is in many ways the difference between a contractor being selected as the low bidder, the low qualified bidder, and the difference between somebody losing out. And there's time after time, particularly in the construction industry, where by deviating and going around the rules of what an independent contractor is, that gives them an unfair, illegal advantage. And this is something that is not designed, it's not helping the employee, it's shorting around the rules and creating an unfair, illegal advantage. So New Jersey, where I am from, our Commissioner of Labor, Rob Angelo, had instituted an ABC test that has worked quite well, frankly. In fact, we get virtually 0 complaints from the employee, but hear much from employers who traditionally would operate within that gray zone. So I think, like any of us, doing an examination of what actually is happening, audits are generally something that everybody in Congress likes because it cuts through the BS and finds out what are the facts. And it's extraordinary to hear that audits are now the bad thing that we should be doing. I hear this day after day, we need to find out facts, and I agree with that. So in 2019, they put together this task force on employee misclassification. And remarkably, they found in New Jersey that over 12,000 were misclassified with the equivalent of over $462 million of wages underreported. Now, I don't suggest anybody who's an independent contractor is not following the rules. In fact, I would guess that most of them. Remarkably, during the pandemic, independent contractors were able to get unemployment. That doesn't happen normally. They were self-reporting and they got unemployment because they needed it. We all understand that. But there's a difference between playing by the rules and taking unfair advantage to illegally lower the wages. So, Mr. Long, coming from the construction industry, you see time after time low bid going in if it's not a negotiated job, and you see what can and can't be done, what your contractors do versus others. Can you kind of walk us through how misclassification would give a contractor an unfair advantage?
Well, in our industry, and especially in this market, 50% of our cost is labor. So if you have a firm that can take advantage of the independent contracting and reduce their burden of cost on those workers anywhere from 20 to 40%, you can see the magnitude on the balance sheet. That's one. Number two, we as contractors are trying to develop training programs and advancement placement for our workers. And on top of that, we have to ensure a safe worker at OSHA. We have to live by the city regs. Every one of our contractors are masters of their trade. They've took license certification examination. They have to pay the cost for liability and operating insurance. 99% of them have a place of address. They're paying local taxes. They're developing the community. In the process, they're raising the worker as they go. Our organization spends hundreds of millions of dollars on technical training. And your colleague was just talking about broadband. We're ramping up all the training with broadband because we know that that's going to be as essential as electricity and water. Those are kind of things. And when we have a situation, and it really affects, Congressman Orcross, it really affects our small business owners that are getting started because they need that bid, and 20 to 40% difference puts them in business or out of business. And so they don't have an opportunity to expand and to grow and hire 4 more people and bid more work and buy more trucks, and pay more taxes, and build a community from a broad base. And that's what the American dream is to own a business and move forward. We're not for people not starting businesses and being independent and do the things they want to do. We just want them to make sure that there's an even playing field for our contractors.
Thank you. And Chairman, I yield back.
Without objection, before we close, I enter into the record letters opposing the Biden administration's proposed independent contractor rule from the Coalition for Workforce Innovation, the Direct Selling Association, the Financial Services Institute, Flex Association, the Intermodal Association of North America, leading financial services trade associations, the Modern Economy Project, the National Association of Home Builders, the National Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors, the National Association of Small Trucking Companies, the National Retail Federation, the Transportation Alliance, and truckers integral to our economy. I would like to again thank our witnesses for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. Without objection, there being no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.